Hello, my name is Stephen Cave. I'm director of a research centre here at the University of Cambridge called the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence. And I would like to welcome you to this Cambridge Festival panel on animals and humans towards a more equal relationship. Now, with the news full of pandemics and wars, it can be hard to focus on something so perennial as our relationship with animals. But our panelists today will argue that this is not just a timeless question, it is also a timely one, indeed an urgent one. Now, if you live in an urban or suburban existence, as I do, it can seem that animals play a very marginal role in our lives. A few pets and garden birds are the only creatures to interrupt a world made by and for humans, a world that is becoming ever more virtual, just like we're meeting remotely today, ever more disconnected from our fellow beings. But we are still surrounded by animals. There aren't fewer animals alive today, just fewer kinds. A once immense variety of birds and mammals and reptiles is being pushed aside and replaced with a handful of species useful to us, like pigs and dairy cows. According to one recent study, farmed poultry today make up 70% of all birds on the planet. For mammals, the figures are even more shocking. 96% of all mammals on Earth are either humans or our livestock. Just 4% of mammals are wild. So there are still vast numbers of animals, but most of us never see these vast numbers. We don't see the 19 billion chickens alive on the planet, for example. We don't use fewer animals than our ancestors. We've just hidden them away in factory-like enclosures, out of sight and often out of mind. But of course, we don't just have one kind of relationship with animals. Some we cuddle and coddle, some we designate as endangered and try to protect, but mostly we treat animals with indifference at best and as resources to exploit at worst. So it's crucial to ask ourselves what kind of worldview, what philosophies and ideologies underpin this relationship of indifference and exploitation. And the clue, I think, is in the title of this panel. How many of you listening today found the title Animals and Humans odd? Perhaps a handful, but I'm guessing the majority of you did not. But of course, we humans are animals. We're mammals, we're apes. To say animals and humans is as absurd as saying animals and hedgehogs. But it doesn't sound absurd because we're so used to setting ourselves apart from the rest of creation. For the past few minutes, I've been talking about our relationship with animals, and I'm sure none of you thought it the least bit odd. But I should, of course, have been talking about our relationship with other animals. But even that does violence to the immense variety of living things, from worms to sparrows to rhinos. To talk of animals and humans not only wrongly sets us apart, an absurdity 160 years after Darwin published On the Origin of Species, but it also treats this immense variety of other animals as if they were just one kind of thing. The animals, a mass of brutes, somewhere well below us, humans, on the great chain of being. This isn't the only way to see our relationship with other animals. It's a way of seeing the world that has arisen from a very particular legacy of ancient Greek philosophy, Judeo-Christian religion, capitalist economics, and imperialist politics. It's a way of seeing that has enabled humans to expand in numbers and prosperity, although far from equally, of course. But it's also an ideology that comes at great cost, which is now becoming clear. We need to recalibrate. We need a new relationship with the natural world. And here to explore this with me today, we have a fantastic panel of thinkers who bring four very different but incredibly important perspectives. They are Sujit Sivasundaram, Professor of Global History here at Cambridge, Mark Rowlands, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Miami, Hayley McGregor, Professor of Medical Anthropology and Global Health at the Institute of Development Studies, and Ganga Singh, Assistant Professor in the Department of Psychological and Behavioral Science at the LSE. I'm going to invite each of them to speak for 5 minutes or so before we move on to our discussion. And first of all, we have Professor Sujit Sivasundaram. To introduce him properly, as well as being Professor of World History, Sujit is a Fellow of Gonville and Caius College and Director of the Centre of Asian Studies here at Cambridge. His recent book, Waves Across the South, A New History of Revolution and Empire, won the British Academy's Book Prize for 2021 for Global Cultural Understanding. And his work on animal history includes research on elephants in South Asia and a recent piece in the journal Past and Present on COVID-19 and the zoonotic disease frontier. Sujit is also president of the Pacific Circle, a group of scholars devoted to the study of nature, science, and knowledge in historical context across the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Sujit, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephen, for the welcome, and I look forward to this important discussion. So, as Stephen has just said, I have long been interested in the status of animals in world history, and in particular, their relationship with empires. So this interest began quite some years ago when I got into a piece of research on elephants in South Asia. And here I was interested in how the British took India, and as they took India, they had to learn how to capture elephants, how to breed elephants, and also how to fight with elephants. And here I'm going to share some images just to give you some sense of this. And as you can see, this is an image from Sri Lanka in 1817. It's of an elephant kraal. So the elephants here are being rounded up by the British just 2 years after the fall of the Kingdom of Kandy. Here we have a second image of an elephant kraal in 1846. So a way of actually sort of rounding up elephants. Again, this image too is from Sri Lanka, but this is actually the case right across South Asia, that Britons had to learn how to capture and breed elephants as well as fight with elephants. And that's partly because of the terrain in South Asia, because if you went to war, you had to take supplies and you had to take men across vast distances, across a terrain which is uneven, and so animal labor was really significant to the colonization of South Asia. But one could also argue that it was symbolically important in South Asia to know how to deal with elephants, because the symbol of the elephant was tied with emperorship in the Mughal Empire, for instance, of South Asia. And of course, it was religiously significant as a motif as well. So so if you're making an empire like the British Empire in South Asia, you need not only to tap into the technical skills of keeping animals like elephants, you also need to tap into the symbolic repertoire of rule in South Asia, and their animals are really significant. So in many ways, that earlier research, and here's another image actually, this time from London in 1844, and this is one of the stories that really got me into this research on elephants, where India itself becomes an elephant that is being shot on the streets of London. And this was a sensation in mid-19th century London, the story of the shooting of the elephant who was in a menagerie in central London. So this earlier research on the British Empire was very much about how humans needed elephants and had to understand elephants if they were to colonize India. But in the midst of the recent pandemic, and in the light of quite a bit of new work in animal history, I reconsidered this way of thinking about humans and other animals, I should say, following Stephen here. Because historians of the wider world need not only to think about how human power is linked to the taming and utilization of animals, or indeed how human cultural systems or civilizations are represented by animal motifs. Rather, we need a history which is about the assembly, the complex of the human and the animal. So what I mean by this is that historical change has happened at the interface of the human and the other animal, rather than through the distinct category of the human as separable from the animal, to follow again what Stephen has just been telling us. So we must be less human-centered in our historical methods. In order to illustrate this view, I began in this paper, which I recently published in Past and Present, with the premise that COVID-19, the pandemic, is really inseparable from the environmental crisis. And the reason for this, of course, is well known because it's a zoonotic transfer that is likely to be at the center of the COVID-19 pandemic. But of course, it comes through humans intruding into biodiverse areas, using land in new ways. And one could add into this also the way industrial farming is a problem, because industrial farming creates genetically similar populations across which disease can spread really rapidly. So both in relation to the use of new lands and humans going into these wild areas in new ways, but also in relation to industrial farming, we have a context for actually linking the COVID-19 pandemic and the environmental crisis. So to illustrate this, I actually kind of sketched the history of the pangolin as just a sort of arbiter, as a sort of tracer of the changeable relationship between humans and animals that lies at the heart of the interlinking of the COVID-19 pandemic and the environmental crisis. And I'm just going to quickly summarize a few of the steps here. The first step in the story, which gets us to a kind of different history here, which is less human-centered, is really the classificatory confusion in the early modern period over the pangolin. So early modern naturalists just did not know what to do with this creature, here seen on the extreme right. So was the pangolin a lizard? Was it a fish? Specimens were kind of assembled with various different animal parts from around the world in early modern cabinets of curiosity. Is the pangolin related to an armadillo, etc., etc.? And fundamentally, I guess, in the early modern period, this was a time when theology was a huge consideration in terms of classifying animals. And the question was, well, what is this creature for? Why is it designed like this? So really fundamental confusion about how to kind of come to terms with an animal like the pangolin in relation to human knowledge. So that's step one. Step two, and here I again return to South Asia to give some coherence to this presentation, is what one could call modern imperialism. And here, whilst imperialists in places like South Asia needed elephants, they didn't need a creature like the pangolin. And actually here, what one finds is real kind of confusion or even evasion once again. So if confusion was the first step with early modern classification, here really evasion and misunderstanding between humans and pangolins. So we get wonderful accounts, for instance, of settlers in South Asia. Here I think of one man, F.W. Champion in 1933, a well-known Indian forester and wildlife photographer who wrote The Jungle in the Sunlight and the Shadow, who tries to tame pangolins, and the pangolins actually attack his bathroom and even attack his bottom, right? And so really sort of stories like that, getting to her settlement colonization, one doesn't need a creature like the pangolin, but also it just does not work. The pangolin is nocturnal, it rolls up into a ball when there is human contact, and really it's not possible to tame this creature in a way that's satisfying for the needs of imperialism. That's step two. Step three is where we're at now, which is exponential killing. Because of course, the pangolin is now the most trafficked mammal in the world, and China is the greatest consumer. In China, ground up pangolin scales are used in traditional medicine, fresh pangolin blood or fetuses are considered an aphrodisiac, etc., etc. Something like 895,000 animals or their derivatives were trafficked between August 2000 and July 2019. So this is a global trade. I mean, certainly a lot of it is going to China, but we really need to keep in mind that it's a global trade. And we've also got to remember that early modern Europeans, after all, collected pangolin specimens as well. So it's not just the case that we can sort of point to China in this story. So what I'm saying here is that this historical narrative, confusion, evasion, misunderstanding, leading to exponential killing, is really one of the contexts for explaining the conjoining of the environmental crisis with the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm not saying that the pangolin is the creature who was the sort of middle of that kind of line of disease transmission. I'm just sort of suggesting that this is indicative, suggestive of really the dynamics through which the COVID-19 pandemic and the environmental crisis became conjoined. But I have a fourth step as well. And this fourth step is about indigenous peoples and their knowledges of the pangolin. Here I argue that indigenous or aboriginal peoples have different relations with animals. Animals are enchanted. Animals can become human or kin. We need to return to a view like this in order to come to a different future beyond that determined by the pathways of empire and colonization of people and nature. I don't have time here to go into this in detail, but I thought I would just read a ballad connected to the pangolin from Sri Lanka, from the Vedda or Vanyalato community, seen to be amongst the first people of island Sri Lanka. And this particular ballad comes from a collection which was collected in the 1950s. Rocked little one, crying little one, get to sleep little one, roasted little one, pangolin little one, sleep little one. So this is a lullaby, but it blurs the distinction between human progeny and the pangolin. And this comes, of course, from a community which reveres ancestors, but also where the pangolin is used for food. So it's really a fundamental form of recognition across the boundary of the human and the other animal, to take Stephen's category. So to be clear here, I'm not saying that the pangolin caused COVID-19. What I'm trying to do here is to illustrate some of the possible circumstances that led to our present moment, and also why we need other modes of storytelling about the human-animal interface. And we also need humanities and science studies scholars to talk to each other. And we need a history which is less human-centered. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sujit. That was absolutely fascinating. And we're used to the idea that history has been written from too partial a perspective, that it needs to be rewritten to accommodate other views, the perspectives of other genders and classes and races and nationalities. The idea that it must take into account the views of other species does indeed sound like the next revolution, and a really interesting and important one. We're now going to move to philosophy. We have Mark Rowlands. Mark, as I mentioned, is a professor of philosophy at the University of Miami. He's the author of 21 books translated into more than 20 languages, many of them about our relationship with animals, as well as works on consciousness and the mind. His works in ethics include Animal Rights, The Environmental Crisis, Animals Like Us, and Can Animals Be Moral? He's also written several popular books, and his memoir about life with one animal in particular, called The Philosopher and the Wolf, was an international bestseller. Mark, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Many discussions of our relations to animals make a moral case. Our treatment of animals must change because it's morally wrong. I'm going to take a different approach today and develop a prudential case. It's in our rational self-interest to radically change the way we interact with other animals. So the three gravest environmental problems of today. First, there's the problem of mass extinction. Species are dying out at rates at least 1,000 times the usual background rate of extinction. Then pandemic, newly emerging infectious diseases. I take it that this needs no elaboration. And third, climate change. The planet is warming at a rate that is unprecedented, and if unchecked, will be disastrous. Our ancient habit of eating animals lies at the heart of all three problems. Breaking this habit is essential to a solution. So with regard to mass extinction, as a recent global assessment report from IPBES, the UN's Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, makes clear, the primary driver of species extinction is habitat loss. The primary cause of habitat loss is agricultural expansion, and the primary form of agricultural expansion is pastoral, that's animal agriculture. If we give up eating animals, we also quell our insatiable hunger for land that is driving mass extinction. With the pandemic, almost all newly emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic. The disease is acquired from other animals. And most pathogens never make the jump from the original host species, but some do. And while there are several factors that influence the likelihood of this jump, we have control of only one of these, really, frequency of encounters between us and the original host species. The more we encounter other animals, the more likely we are to become homes for their pathogens. We encounter animals most when we farm them. Domestication is responsible for most temperate diseases, or when we encroach on their territory, which we do most, as Ipbes has pointed out, when we convert their habitats to grazing land. Those are straightforward cases where the connection between the practices and animals and the problems we face are clear. Climate change is more complicated, but there's still a very deep and important connection here. To understand climate change, you have to understand just how unusual the past few centuries have been in human history. Vast societies of the sort we inhabit today are the exception rather than the norm. And like any complex structure, societies require a net input of energy to survive. The net energy of the source is the amount of energy you get from it minus the amount of energy you needed to put in to get it. So if you mine a certain seam of coal, you can burn the coal, which gives you a certain amount of energy. Against that, there's the energy you have to put into digging out the coal. The net energy is the former minus the latter, the energy you get out minus the energy you put in. Now, societies in today's developed world have been built on energy sources, fossil fuels, with extraordinarily high net energies. Historically, coal and oil sported net energies of around 100. That's changing. Today, estimated net energies of fossil fuels coalesce in the sort of 25 to 29 range. And if we're to make fossil fuels climate friendly, we'll need to employ widespread carbon capture and sequestration technology, which is energetically speaking very expensive indeed, and will result in a further substantial decline of the energy of the net energy of fossil fuels. With regard to alternatives, the net energy of nuclear fission has never been that high for a variety of reasons. Peer-reviewed estimates generally range from 5 to 14. With regard to renewables, estimates vary also. Solar estimates vary from 1 to 10, wind 3 to 18. Temperate biofuels are terrible, very, very low, 1 to 3 estimates. So I think the general picture is that current alternatives to fossil fuels are well below the historical net energies that allowed us to build modern societies. When the net energies of our sources drop below a certain level, our society will no longer be sustainable in its current form. So this raises the question of what net energy values do we need from our energy sources? Peer-reviewed calculations, again, coalesce in the region of 11 to 14. That's the minimum we need. Other desirable features of successful liberal democracies, high scores on the Human Development Index, combating childhood malnutrition, female literacy, things like this, are likely to need energy sources with net energies a bit higher than that, around 20. Around 25. Therefore, as things stand, it's very unclear that we have the energy sources required to maintain societies recognizably like our own. This is where animals enter the picture. Our energy choices come in the form of food as well as fuel. Eating animals is a disastrous energy choice with net energy values well into negative territory, between -70 and -95. We could get away with this when we had fuel choices with high net energies of the sort sported historically by fossil fuels. But in our now diminished energy circumstances, eating animals is becoming a luxury we can no longer afford. In addition, no longer eating animals would remove 14.5% of climate emissions from the atmosphere. It would also allow us to do perhaps the single most important thing we can do to combat climate change, afforestation, the planting of forests on land that in the recent past has not had trees on it. Offsetting the carbon footprint of the average US citizen is thought to require around about 3 acres of afforested land. So the 330 million population of the US requires 990 million acres. How much land will be made available if we no longer eat meat? Well, in the US, probably somewhere in the region of 830 million acres. 830 million is not 990 million, but it's surprisingly close. That's how much of a dent we could put into climate change for the simple expedient of no longer eating animals. So to summarize, our ancient habit of eating animals lies at the heart of the 3 gravest environmental problems we face today, and breaking this habit is essential to their solution.
Thank you, Mark. And I mean, you've written so much on our moral obligations to animals and indeed the moral lives of animals. It's so interesting to hear you now making a prudential argument, and perhaps that's something we will come back to. But first, I'd like to pass the virtual microphone to Hayley McGregor. Hayley is Professor of Medical Anthropology and Global Health at the Institute of Development Studies, and she co-leads the Health and Nutrition Research Cluster. She first trained as a medical doctor in South Africa before coming here to Cambridge to do her PhD on the experience of mental disturbance in low-income urban settlement in South Africa. And her research interests now include emerging infectious disease, the anthropology of antimicrobial resistance, informality in health provision, and concepts of care and chronicity in responses to lifelong illness. Hayley, I can imagine you've had a busy couple of years with the COVID outbreak. Over to you.
Indeed, Stephen. So I'm speaking, as you can hear, to the health angle of this discussion, particularly related to current concerns about zoonotic disease emergence and disease preparedness for future pandemics. So there are different perspectives on the problem of zoonoses, and these in turn involve distinctive views of human-animal relations. And I'm going to suggest that a greater appreciation of such differences is critical for more effective and sensitive interventions to control disease. Moreover, we need to deepen integrative understandings of the dynamics at play as both biological and social, with intracellular events dependent on interactions between species that are in turn shaped by sociocultural logics, as well as the wider environmental and and political economic conditions that we've been hearing about from Sujit and Mark. So biomedical or public health perspectives of zoonotic disease focus on a biological view of risky interspecies contacts that might lead to so-called pathogen spillover. Thus, outbreak preparedness is oriented to surveillance of wildlife populations for concerning organisms and efforts for early detection and containment of outbreaks in livestock or humans. Interventions to reduce transmission events have focused on the human-animal interface, especially circumstances that encourage frequent and close contact. So avian influenza saw the culling of poultry, Ebola, attention to bushmeat trade, and COVID-19 has seen a spotlight on wild animal markets. But purely technical approaches to surveillance and early detection can really underestimate the complexity of contexts and of shifting relations between humans, animals, and their environments. And furthermore, conceptualizations of human-animal relations merely in terms of zoonotic risk can diverge quite significantly from perspectives on the ground. First, people's own understandings of priority threats to health and well-being and the causes of disease might differ from the views of those designing interventions for zoonotic disease control. Secondly, the realities in local contexts necessitate trade-offs between disease risks and economic risks, particularly in situations of poverty. Changes in behavior related to farming, hunting, or marketing might be constrained by wider structural realities and the precarities of subsistence livelihoods. Interventions that don't take account of these realities can reinforce deep social, economic, and also health inequalities. And third, people's views of animals vary in different sociocultural contexts, as Sujit was arguing, and disease-oriented perspectives assume firm species boundaries that should be maintained to reduce risk. But within disciplines such as anthropology, there's interest in alternative ontological orientations that consider human being amidst other non-human animals, including various microorganisms. Thus, views of human-animal ecosystem relations might understand the place of the human species in much more integral and equal relations with environments. So let me give an example from interdisciplinary research on pig farming in Myanmar. Concern in this project has been to track the risks to human and animal health related to intensification of pig farming in line with other Southeast Asian economies and also nutrition demands. In the project, laboratory science is focused on the prevalence of pathogens related to endemic foodborne zoonoses that are responsible for considerable morbidity. But social science explored the local ecological and livelihood context of human-animal interactions. So standard interventions tend to focus on the behavior of farmers and factors such as low investment in biosecurity. However, small-scale farmers operate in circumstances with very close contact to a range of backyard livestock. Livelihoods are marginal, and pigs are often kept as a form of financial insurance to sell for quick cash. Farmers also relate relationships with their pigs that go beyond a focus on their economic value. And this was particularly evident in their care of sick pigs and in the feeding, with pigs at times referred to as like their children. Effective and acceptable interventions to address zoonotic risks require an appreciation of different conditions and life worlds in such places considered hotspots for disease emergence. And these alternative perspectives can inform thinking about planetary health, but also more sustainable futures where different concerns and interests also need to be navigated. And the COVID pandemic has brought what one might call challenging biosocial environments into sharp relief, including those implicating human-animal relations. And from my perspective, I would conclude that we need to reach a deeper appreciation of these unstable biological and social dynamics as mutually constituted. And so much research still operates in disciplinary silos, and there's less attention to developing more integrated biosocial conceptualizations to bring better understanding of how the social and environmental can act to shape biological outcomes, or how structural conditions are implicated in biological vulnerabilities. And my hope would be that such insights can inform a rethinking of epidemic preparedness and also place it in the context of these wider challenges such as climate change. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Hayley. And it's so interesting to hear such a sort of passionate and well-grounded plea for interdisciplinarity, which can sound like a very abstract concept, relevant only to those of us in the academy. And I think you've made very clear why it's so important and relevant. And finally, I would like to introduce Ganga Sridhar. Ganga is an assistant professor in LSE's Department of Psychological and Behavioral Science. She is an applied behavioral and experimental economist, studying how to change human behavior in ways that simultaneously benefit people and the planet. Her research looks at how to motivate environmental action across consumer and citizen domains, and how they can be deployed in behaviorally smart informational campaigns, nudges, and incentives to create sustainable habits. Ganga, take it away.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Great to be here. So a lot of behavior change interventions typically tend to sort of build on the idea that even small tweaks in the way we present information can be super compelling and get people to change actions. So an example from what's going on at the moment is, for instance, framing energy conservation as a national security issue rather than a climate change issue, right? So by drawing our attention to particular attributes of a particular decision context, for instance, we might be motivated in different ways and therefore change our behavior. So as we've, you've just said, Stephen, but also Sujit, like we've talked about how often, and Mark and Hayley, all of you have talked about how our interactions really with animals are super important for not just how we behave, but also the stories we tell about them. And it's no wonder now that in behavioral science, we're increasingly looking at the role of stories to develop these connections with animals and non-human nature. And to very intuitively, Blue Planet is kind of one of the poster child examples of that, where across the world, especially something like the ocean, which is very difficult for people without the expertise or the infrastructure to access, we're actually able to go deep in and see how, for instance, plastic pollution affects the fertility of whales and what that means for their endurance and survival. So the idea is that these sort of compelling stories, which are typically focused on individuals struggling to achieve something, or more sort of like a, this is the problem, this is the cause, this is the solution format. These sorts of stories can arguably, educate people, spark interest, but also induce quite strong emotional reactions like awe or wonder or fear or nostalgia. And it's through these stories that we've traditionally tried to change behavior with respect to animals. right? So the typical template that we've used is either look at these cool animals in pristine nature doing their thing. So this is how this male bird sings around and hops, and then the female gets attracted. So that's a plot. And then you've got another plot, which is sort of like the end of nature plot, which is sort of like, look, this is what the original range of a particular species was in the savannah, and now that range is reduced, and we really need their help, so please donate. Right? So typically with these stories come a sort of call to action, but that call to action is not always implicit, but it's not always explicit either. So in the plastic pollution case with Blue Planet, maybe people might have inferred from those stories, let's cut down our plastic pollution. From something like a donations appeal, which uses a story, the idea would be donate now. You could, adopt an elephant and therefore protect them in some way. When we actually look at what the evidence is, like, are these stories effective? It's not very clear. So controlled studies show that Blue Planet, for instance, sparked a huge amount of discourse and policy conversation about plastic pollution. But when you actually look at the everyday behaviors people took, controlled studies show maybe they didn't have much of an enduring effect. Similarly, other big movies which have been studied, like The Inconvenient Truth in the Climate Space, for instance, show there's a short-term effect on things like carbon offsets, but not necessarily a long-term one. Secondly, like, when we look at these stories, there's been a lot of hesitance to include humans in them, right? Blue Planet is a new sort of mode of storytelling where we're not looking at a pristine environment, we're looking at how human action has changed an outcome. And we do know that people care more about human stories than animal stories. So if you make it about how we've caused a negative outcome, we call this the outrage effect in economics and psychology, people are outraged about how we've caused environmental degradation, and that might induce them to donate. So a couple of experiments that I've run, both in the context of wildlife conservation, but also in the context of COVID, show that if you attribute the loss of nature to human action, then we're more likely to not just support conservation policies, but also take actions like donations. So in the COVID context, for instance, if you say that the cause of COVID in a media story was due to animals, so it was an animal virus, people are not that interested in supporting conservation measures. But if you talk about how our interaction with humans have depleted natural environments and raised the risk of zoonotic spillovers through, for instance, the way we produce and consume things, people are more likely to support animal conservation policies. But stories are fickle. So the moment you add a counter narrative to something like, hey, but there's this alternative story, which is it could have been an outbreak from a lab in Wuhan, which was very prominent at the time, people's support for policy gets diffused. So it doesn't really matter if you've got a lot of information to change your mind. What matters is whether you think there's a compelling counter story. And the moment you see a counter story, often that support gets diffused. So we have to think about what else we can do. Right? Can we tell other compelling stories? So we ran an example now. Amitav Ghosh came up recently with a great derangement, and he draws our attention to the lack of everyday heroes in taking action and negotiating climate change in their everyday lives. So we looked at whether profiling everyday heroes in short fiction stories actually motivates support. So we sort of workshopped a story with my grad students. And we basically said, hey, look at this person taking all these really complicated actions, changing diets, signing a petition at work, negotiating the social barriers they face, but taking those actions to save the environment, as opposed to another counter story, which was doing those same actions to improve their health or for status, like posting on social media. We found that only when actions within stories were intentional, so when the person was motivated to save the environment, did they have an effect. So it's not just what the cause is, it's also what the motivations of the character within the story are, which can actually drive changes in behavior, because we infer what we should be doing from what other people are doing. We look at other people's motivations as signals for our own actions. So, we can move beyond end of story templates, for instance, and think about actually profiling people doing things in their everyday lives. And there've been lots of examples of this. For instance, conservation optimism is an example of this sort of initiative. Another option for us is to go back to history and think about what stories we've told and which ones are still potent. So D.N. Jha, for instance, looks at how the myth of the holy cow has evolved. So by analyzing Vedic texts dating back thousands of years, 1,000 to 1,500 years or so, he shows how cows have been described using simile and metaphor, and those can be ambiguously interpreted. So although we had Vedic Aryans who used to eat beef and do ritual animal sacrifice, those same texts are now interpreted to mean that the cow is sacred, apart from being economically important. So can we use those sacred beliefs and those stories then to change behavior? Yes and no, right? So if you only care about changing behavior, then use the sacred stories, because that is linked to advocacy for cow ban slaughter, as well as avoiding beef eating. But if you think about the motivations driving that, they're really ambiguous. So other studies show, for instance, that if you have a sacred belief driving people's actions, often sacred beliefs reduce the risk of pollution risk perception. So studies show that if you look at those who believe the Ganges River is very sacred in India, they perceive it to be less polluted. If they perceive it to be less polluted, we're less likely to change our behaviors and pollute it less, right? So motivations matter. Secondly, there are unintended consequences of pulling on particular stories. For instance, in the case of the sacred cow belief, these myths have been used to both draw differences between what it means to be Hindu and a wrong Hindu, but also what it means to be Hindu versus a Muslim. And these sorts of differences that we use stories to construct differences and draw boundaries, not just with animals, but also with other humans, is important to keep in mind, because these stories aren't very neutral. They come with a lot of baggage. So where does this really leave us from a behavior change perspective? I feel like stories not just represent relationships, but they also are used to define boundaries about who's in your social group and who isn't, and change behavior, right? The effects of these stories are very ambiguous. So they can have short-run effects because they can be emotionally compelling. In the long run, we're not very sure, right? In the long run, what matters is how these stories are repeated, recounted, shared, and a supporting infrastructure of behavioral policies, whether they're a set of tax-based policies or legislations or harder policies to make it easier for people to do the right thing, but also signal to people what the right thing to do is. So we can't just rely on stories and expect them to do the job of changing behaviors and policy, right? And we also need to be quite cautious about storytelling. There are particular stories which can be interpreted in ambiguous ways, used the wrong way, or use the right way. It depends. And we have to be quite cautious. So I think while I do think that stories are super important to represent and change behavior, we have to use a cautious approach to telling stories and not only rely on them. That's it.
Well, thank you. That's absolutely fascinating. And if we can stay on the idea of storytelling for a moment, at the beginning of this session, I was talking a bit about the underlying philosophies and ideologies that underpin our relationship with other animals. I could have used the word mythologies, which are really the stories we tell that embody our values, which sum up these relationships for us, which tell us, for example, that we humans are at the top of the great chain of being and are allowed to dominate the rest of nature and so on. These are stories. It sounds like you're working towards a kind of empirically grounded, optimal mythology for our relationship with the rest of the planet. I mean, do you think we can use stories to shift these kind of myths, these meta-narratives that shape our behavior?
Absolutely. And I think one way of looking at stories is, for instance, something like a nature documentary, but all documents, science models have stories. Disciplines have stories which they hold dear, right? So, for instance, if we look at the Dasgupta Review, which is a seminal piece of work which really tries to aggregate the best evidence possible on the economics of biodiversity, it takes an explicitly anthropocentric position by saying that it's in our interest to save nature because our existence depends on nature. It's been critiqued by other economists, for instance, by adopting this anthropocentric view, for instance, Nicholas Trick, because, for instance, it could mandate significantly different policy implications. So, for instance, more humane methods for addressing invasive species. I think a separate view I take is that by unintentionally adopting these positions, even if you think it strategically works, because you can persuade people who have those positions, right? There's this unintentional consequence of creating this psychological distance between us and animals. And that in turn allows us to exploit and consume them. So there's a lot of interesting work, including from Cambridge, actually coming out on the role of speciesism and how that speciesism predicts animal consumption, animal exploitation, tolerance for inhumane conditions, etc. And these sorts of anthropocentric positions can unintentionally have that effect to shift these values progressively over time. And these are these meta-narratives within a science, but it works for mythology as well. So I definitely think that we need to think through carefully and test using empirics and go back to history and think about what we can learn, whether these value changes are actually occurring, because we do have now data, and we do have really amazing experimental methods where we can plot them. So I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done at that intersection.
Thank you. Now, Mark, you've done so much work throughout your career to get us to take a less anthropocentric view. And yet now in the presentation you just gave, it's like you've accepted that we just are anthropocentric, and you're making the case that even if we take an anthropocentric view, we oughtn't maintain our current relationship to animals. Is that a fair summary of your current position?
I haven't given up on the case for sort of moral persuasion. I think different forms of persuasion, impact different people in different sorts of ways. I think there's a general perception amongst policymakers that if you want to get anything done, any persuasion done at all, then you need to adopt an anthropocentric approach. And so, when you read documents produced by IPBES, for example, who I mentioned in my talk, it's all anthropocentric. It's all about the dire effects that loss of species will have on us humans, and very little else. So they've assumed that that's the way to go. When you read the kind of documents produced by the IPC, the International Panel on Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the same approach. I mean, climate change is bad first and foremost for them because of its effects on human beings. It's ironic, of course, because it's this sort of obsession with ourselves which has led us to these problems in the first place. And the only way we can think about why these problems are problems is because of their effect on us. So there is a sort of deep irony there. I think any case that can be made for environmental change or changing our relationships with animals can be developed in a variety of ways. A moral way is one, prudential way is another. I don't know which is more successful. I suspect prudential approaches are probably, in the short term at least, more compelling to most people. But that's maybe because I'm just a jaded moral philosopher. I don't know.
Thank you, Mark. And Sujit, history is a form of storytelling, albeit one that aspires to fact rather than fiction. I mean, do you hope by telling history, by writing history differently from a less anthropocentric perspective, to change contemporary views, to shift us away from anthropocentrism?
Yeah, so it's been interesting listening to the other presentations as well. And I was thinking about Ganga's commentary on storytelling in relation, which I can respond to as well as your question, Stephen. So I guess, we need lots of different kinds of stories is one way to take this forward. And within history as well, we need lots of different kinds of stories, right? So ideally, we should have different genres of storytelling, not simply textual. So history, which is artifactual, exhibitions, which is filmic. We need sorts of collaborations, really, which allow stories to be multiple in terms of genre. We need stories to start from different places and different times as well, rather than only from our present moment. Because I guess moralism and the pros and cons of moralism will look very different if you're at the sort of frontier of a forest in the interior of India to if you're sitting in the West in an office. So I think that actually, what we take to be moralism or what we take to be a persuasive argument is different in different places. And what we need is something that actually is not globally the same everywhere, but which is different in different places. So we need lots of different kinds of stories by way of genre. We need different kinds of stories by way of starting point, I would argue. And maybe also in terms of this divide between fiction and fact. So one of the interesting things that was just mentioned was Amitabh Ghosh's work. And of course, he's just published another book, Nutmeg's Curse, which has been in the press recently. And this is a novelist who's turned to nonfiction. And I think actually sort of blurring those boundaries, because I think we take facts to be really, really important. And of course, facts are really important. But what's quite clear in relation to the climate crisis is that, facts haven't reached everyone. And so we do need ways in which we can combine factual reporting and the presentation of evidence with storytelling of a whole series of kinds, which are rigorous. And so if we have all of these different kinds of stories, which are culturally diverse, which are diverse by way of genre, which are diverse by way of form, then we presumably will avoid the problems of Hindutva, which Ganga was talking about in relation to the cow, because in a sense, if a story is just one thing, it can fall back on a kind of nationalist or fundamentalist sort of position, which is dangerous.
Thank you, Mark.
Yes, if I could just jump in there, actually. I mean, what I think stories are great conveyors of concepts, and one of the big problems we have with thinking about environmental issues is that we don't have the concepts required to understand what's going on. I mean, consider the kind of figures you were talking about at the beginning from the Baron, Milo, Phillips biomass calculations for various species. 96% of the biomass the mammalian biomass on the planet is made up of humans or the animals humans eat. 70% of all birds are made up of domestic fowl, basically. And when you compare this with, say, you know, the state of the planet at the end of the last ice age, where there was just a fantastic bestiary of barely imagined sort of animals, you know, all over the place. And what we did, I mean, I think probably the single most compelling definition of human beings, we're biomass reallocators. We take biomass and we convert it into other forms of biomass that is useful to us. And it seems to me that is a huge crime of a certain sort. But part of the problem in developing the idea of a crime is we have no idea what kind of crime it is. The relevant concepts have not yet been invented. And so, I mean, it's tempting, I think, to think of it as maybe what we might call an ontological crime, a crime against being. But then understanding the being of animals is precisely what we then need to understand this notion of a crime. And that's where I think stories of various sorts can be very, very useful. There's a kind of story. I think I understood the being of a wolf, for example. I lived with actually he was a wolf dog mix, but I lived with one for many years. But I didn't really understand the being of a wolf until I started reading about the changes that wolves made when they were reintroduced to Yellowstone. You know, vast changes to, first of all, it reestablished what ecologists call the ecology of fear. And so deer and which had gotten in the habit of just sort of, you know, hanging around in river gorges and eating all the vegetation, couldn't do this anymore because a river gorge is not a good place to get trapped in. And so they had to move around. So the trees gradually restored themselves. This brought in various other sorts of animals. And in the end, there were major changes to even the physical geography of the park. The rivers started flowing in different ways. The banks stopped collapsing. The rivers became more fixed and stable in their patterns and so on. So a massive change. And I think understanding the being of the wolf is understanding its relation in this kind of ecological context. That's a kind of story. I found that's a story of a certain sort, which is very useful. Anyway, sorry.
No, I agree. I mean, I think there's stories of rewilding are incredibly powerful, factual stories, of course, but really compelling. And Hayley, you talked about imagining sustainable futures, and I mean, I'd be very interested to hear from you about the role of storytelling in helping us to do that.
Yeah, I guess my response would be that part of the difficulty, I guess, is that there are so many different interests to take account of, and I mean, perhaps stories can help us appreciate those different interests, because I think Sujit was mentioning, I mean, you know, even different human interests are so complex, and also, you know, they're different policy priorities pulling in different directions. I mean, I hinted at the sort of debates around intensification of farming, and you know, there are questions to be asked. Is that really a sort of sustainable global trajectory? But I also try to bring out these very different interests, including those of you know, sort of small scale subsistence farmers, policymakers concerned about nutrition security, and you know, even in you know, all the current thought about pandemic preparedness, we're fighting between, you know, those that focus very much on human health risks, and then there are also these, you know, much broader questions about planetary health and climate change. So lots of politics, lots of different interests. How does one sort of stem that tide? I think there are also these sort of bigger political questions, and can storytelling help these quite different perspectives to meet together in some common place? That would be the question I ask, because I think it's very difficult to turn the tide, unfortunately.
Yes, thank you. And so one of the stories that we're exploring at the moment is the idea that our relationship with animals and ways in which it has gone wrong are responsible for COVID, and the idea of zoonosis, the transmission of diseases between species that has been discussed by a couple of our panelists. And I'd like to explore that a little bit more. And part of that story is that there are various aspects of our relationship with other species that have changed in profound ways that have enabled this transmission. But people have always lived very closely alongside other species. Indeed, arguably more people, a higher percentage of people at least, lived much more closely to a broader range of species historically than is the case now. So I'll be interested to hear from any of you about why now is a moment of particular danger for zoonosis. Could you unpack that story a little, please? I think I'm going to ask Sujit first, though I think Hayley might be a sort of, I definitely want to come to in a second as the expert on these questions. But I know Sujit has been looking at this from a historical perspective.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, I speak as a historian rather than as a science scholar. So hopefully other people will come in as well. I mean, I think, yes, you're right that we have been living with animals for a long time, but it's that we're entering the sort of frontier, the wildlife frontier in new ways that is changing. So if we think about bats or if we think about pangolins, the point I was making is that there has been really a shift of gears quite recently. And that has come together with extinctions as well as new modes of farming. So I think that is why we're at a different moment, really, in the dangers for zoonotic transfer, as far as I understand it. And historically, this makes sense because really the way deforestation has sort of been patterned, or the way the changes of the 19th and 20th century compare by way of land use and so forth and settlement in relation to previous centuries is, we're on a different scale altogether. So that's how we need to think about it as a different moment. Of course, we can enter this whole debate about the Anthropocene, but I won't go there because that's very complicated. But there is a concept out there to highlight how humans have become geological agents as well. And that is this idea of the Anthropocene, the period of the modern era.
Thank you, Sujit. Ganga and Ganga and then Mark, and then I want to come to Hayley. So Ganga first.
Yeah, I was just thinking that when we say the frontier is changing, I guess there's this disconnect between the stories that we like to hear about animals and the ones that we commonly share without thinking of them as stories, and the ones we don't tell at all. So when I think about the ones that we like to tell, it's the ones featuring beautiful, massive, charismatic mammals. And often they're the ones which are also the subject of most of the research. So if you look at the IUCN database, when I was trying to look at finding a non-charismatic animal to use as an experimental stimuli, I couldn't find a good one. I couldn't find photos of them. And also the information was very old, right? So and we use actually and project historical knowledge, age-old records in those databases when we don't have up-to-date, good scientific research. So we kind of think that that's the world out there, and that's the story that we tell about those animals. But actually, the reality is, as you said, 96% is us or biomass, and the stories we tell about them is, what are you having for dinner, right? Oh, what's that recipe that you like? Can I have that recipe? We don't farm and cook. Most people don't do it. We don't kill the animal and hunt it. And so there's no history or personal relationship. The ones we do see is that branding I like when I go to the supermarket to pick up some meat, right? So that's the sort of story, and that's the sort of active interaction when it comes to something like food. And then, of course, there's the stuff we don't ever talk about, which is all the fungi and the microorganisms and the really ugly species which are dying anyway. right? So when we're thinking about that frontier changing, I think the stories are not catching up with the frontiers that are changing, right? And the stories which we are telling don't really reflect the right type of story, in the sense of it's mostly transactions and sort of like commodified versions of those animals. So I think that that's a really interesting tension, and that can sort of help explain why we're missing out, or we're missing this larger picture a bit when we actually think about, like, what should we do about mass extinction? Nobody knows what to do, because that means figuring out a new recipe. And that's not like the funnest thing to do when you have to talk to your family about like why you're going vegan or something, right? So yeah, I think it's a complicated space.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark.
Actually, Haley's the expert on this, and I think I'd rather hear what Haley has to say than what I have to say.
Yeah, I'd like to hear what you have to say. But in fact, Mark, I am interested because, I think, this actually speaks more to your terrain and the ethics, because I think Sujit captured it perfectly. This century, there is a moment of huge transformation, and as he said, the people who work on the Anthropocene are trying to capture this, and these sort of very unstable interactions that are shifting between animals and humans. There's been a sort of step change as we encroach on animals with animal habitat changes in land use, even sort of political events as conflicts, etc. That the risk of these events appears to be increasing, spillover events. But then we also have endemic zoonoses, as I hinted, that cause a huge amount of human and also animal suffering. So all of this is sort of in the mix, and I think and this is really where I appreciate Mark's view, because it just feels that we navigating a set of compromises, and it comes to your point about human interests, and if we are going to move to these more sustainable futures, for example, that don't involve eating meat, how do we do that in a way that also takes account of livelihoods and perspectives from the majority world, where people are still food insecure.
Yeah, no, I that's right. I mean, when I wrote my book on this, World on Fire, it's very clear that I was addressing this to people in the developed world, were able to do things like stop eating meat without the kind of problems it would cause in areas of the world where people are under far more pressure. That's right. I mean, the general point that Sujit raised about why is it that we've always lived in close proximity to animals? What's the difference now? And I think part of the difference, at least, is that when we put animals under pressure, they do things they wouldn't ordinarily do in places they ordinarily wouldn't do it. And so, I mean, the classic example is the Nipah virus. Is that how you pronounce it? Nipah? Yes. Okay. So, as I understand it, there were several tens of thousands of acres of rainforest in Indonesia were being burned down because of the nascent palm oil industry. As a result, thousands of bats made their way to Malaysia, and some of them alighted next to some very, very large pig farms. They were carrying a virus which, as usual, was harmless to bats, but was fatal to pigs and anyone who'd eaten the pigs. And that was how the Nipah virus got started. Since then, I mean, it hasn't stopped. It's moved to Bangladesh, where it's taken on a slightly different form. It presents in different ways than the Malaysian version. But the root cause was the fact that we were putting bats under pressure, relocating them and causing them to do things they probably wouldn't have done in the absence of these our incursions.
Yeah, thank you. Now, I really enjoyed Ganga's description of our relationship to animals as really one of commodification, as a relationship to meat, if you like, a sort of rationalized, calculating, transactional, commodified relationship. And of course, it made me think about what we've lost in other forms of interacting and thinking about mythologizing our relationship with animals based on rituals and taboos, edicts, if you like, which got swept away with the very sort of rationalizing revolutions in the West, and with the Enlightenment, which have brought us, of course, contributed greatly to a scientific and technological revolution and so on, and helped to bring great prosperity. But the question is, what have we lost? And I mean, Mark, can modern Western ethics deal with questions like the huge loss of biodiversity?
No, I think the problem is we don't yet have the concepts to understand or to capture the immensity of what's going on. A mammalian biomass, there's 90%, 96% us or animals we eat. The immensity of that is just difficult for us to conceive, I think. And so part of what we need to do, part of what I hope philosophy would be trying to do, would be to develop the requisite concepts to understand precisely what it is we've done and what we're doing and how terrible it is. Because failing that, we just fall back on the standard IPCC or the IPBES kind of line. Well, this is a disaster for human beings too, and that's the main problem with it. It's that kind of thinking that got us into these sorts of messes in the beginning, and that's what we need to try and find a way of transcending.
Thank you, Sujit.
Yeah, I mean, on this question of Western ethics, I mean, I think it's really important to actually engage with the history of imperialism and capitalism, because I mean, the point I made about indigenous peoples was partly to sort of speak from a different angle at the story. And so rather than simply kind of working through the trajectories of Western ethics, what we need is to sort of just open our minds to other ways of doing things, which come from frontiers, come from societies which are far away. And so those sorts of stories can be powerful as well. And this sort of goes back really to something that Ganga was saying, that we need not to sort of, our stories shouldn't just be about animals. We need kind of humans to become other animals as well, Stephen, as you were saying earlier. And so really to sort of know more about the ethics of other people and other ethical traditions, just as a sort of fundamental starting point. And also to think about ways of enchanting nature in different ways. And I think, that's something we can all do in the West, in as much as we think about the policy implications of this in a way that is just in relation to the historical trajectories that we have passed through.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge interest in philosophy, in ethics now, in sort of more Eastern traditions, and it's not clear that the answers are going to be there either. I think something is lacking in pretty much everywhere we. No,
sure. I mean, I think it's not that one tradition itself will answer the question, but rather that we should be able to create an instability for our own tradition by kind of engaging with a whole series of others, and then together find a way forward rather than reifying one tradition alone.
Yes, thank you. And I think that's such an important point. Ganga.
Yeah, this is actually thinking about the question of similarity rather than, what place do we give them? So a lot of research on animal sentience, for instance, demonstrates that in many ways that they have problem-solving skills, that they feel things, that they're able to build relationships, have social lives, right? So some of the stuff that research might suggest is that if we stop thinking about like what makes us different and think about what makes us similar, that builds an emotional connection, which can then make us more open to helping or kinder, or have non-transactional, sort of more like gift exchange relationships, even if nothing else. So I was wondering, I'm not an ethicist. This is more a question because I don't understand how this fits into our frameworks. But the way I've seen that fit is by saying we should value individual animal lives. So in a utilitarian sort of setup, is that the only way we could use the idea of sentience? Because if I think of Taoist traditions, for instance, it's about oneness, and that is essentially about non-duality or the similarity. So I was wondering, like, where can we push, like, where can we hark back to those ideas, but also bring in things like the science of sentience to redefine what we should be using as a guiding principle?
Yeah, I mean, utilitarianism is a controversial moral theory. There are lots of alternatives. There are deontological approaches based on those rights or rules. There's a virtue ethical approach grounded in ancient Greek philosophy. Contractualism is another way of thinking about the rights of animals. So that even in the West, I mean, the West is the monolithic tradition. There are all sorts of different approaches. But your question about how we relate this to Taoism is very interesting. What do you have in mind?
No, just the idea that the way I've seen sentience being operated is very much still utilitarian, in the sense that we should think about the welfare of individual animals. Whereas something like a Taoist framework talks about non-duality. I'm not an expert by any means, but my very impressionistic understanding is that there is the idea that actually there are times where people can be animals, animals can be people, and animals are humans, and stones can be humans. Right. And and if you look at the mythology there's lots of people taking forms of different things and animals observing and evaluating humans, So there's the way that we approach those relationships don't seem to only be concerned with protection or exploitation or lives or so is there another ethical framework that comes to mind which accommodates sort of this non-protect or exploit duality, essentially, which is just about coexistence or a different way of thinking?
Well, I mean, if ethics was only concerned with those two alternatives, we'd be in a lot of trouble, I suppose, wouldn't we? But I mean, what you said at the beginning, I think is the basic choice, because on the one hand is the extent to which animals are like us. They can feel, they can problem solve, they can reason in a variety of different ways. They're self-aware, almost certainly. So that all points to, animals are a lot like us, really. Therefore, we should treat them better. Now, others say no, that's not the way to think about it. The way to think about it is we should value animals precisely to the extent that they differ from us, right? I suspect that historically speaking, humans have not been very good at valuing things that are different from them, but perhaps we can do better. I don't know.
The conversation's taken a fascinating turn, and clearly this time next year we need to have a panel on different philosophical and religious approaches to animal ethics. We could bring in some Ubuntu relational ethics. We could bring in Buddhist ethics. Just one observation, and that's through most of the 20th century, many alternative philosophical viewpoints were dismissed as being not sufficiently rational, and yet actually now science is very much catching up with the idea that other animals are sentient as we are, that they're feeling, thinking creatures. Mark's work has done a lot to promote that idea. Now, I'm going to ask each of you for a final thought on ways in which, or a way in which you'd like our relationship with other animals to shift. I'm going to do it in the order in which people first spoke. So Sujit has least time to come up with a pithy response, but I'm sure he will anyway. Sujit, final thoughts.
Well, just in response to the conversation we've just been having, I think we need to think beyond species, and we need to think beyond the human, non-human sort of dichotomy. And so to do that, so humans themselves being a kind of collection of a whole series of, or biomass, as we said, but also kind of living things of all kinds. So really we need to think not just about the sort of human and animal relationship, but a whole series of relationships, and then in turn about how our relations with other animals structure our own relations with other humans in turn as well, around ideas of race or gender, as they have done in history. So it's a really complicated, layered story, and a layered set of research projects and outcomes that we need to build towards.
Thank you. Excellent points. Mark.
Yeah, I think ultimately, Stephen, it all goes back to the point you made at the beginning of the talk about how odd it is to talk about, well, no one thinks it's odd, but when we talk about humans and animals, I mean, that's where it all goes wrong, really. And we've not really ever been able to fully understand or accept that we're just animals. Not qualitatively different from other animals, and until we get that realization, I'm not sure how far we're gonna be able to go.
I completely agree. Hailing.
I wouldn't. I think that's wonderful, and I think we just have to really dig in and explore that richness. I mean, from an anthropological perspective, that would be cross-cultural as well as historical, and absolutely that sort of multi-species perspective bring out the richness of those different knowledges, and in the arena where I work, where biomedical knowledge dominates, it's difficult, but I think a really important task to say these other views matter. And indeed, in this terrain of zoonotic disease, the policy paradigm is one health. People will talk about one world, one health, and I think our discussion is really showing there are many worldviews to appreciate, many interests, and if we can create that kind of environment for dialogue, I think we're more likely to solve some of these admittedly very large challenges for our future.
Yes, thank you. Beautifully said. Ganga.
Yeah, I think from a behavior change perspective, we often rush to figure out what the most effective tool is without really understanding what the existing context. I mean, we always say context matters. So, despite saying that, we often rush out to change behaviors using things like stories without really understanding the entire stream of repercussions that can have. So I think, and I really think that we should start listening a bit more, both to humans as well as non-human animals, and sort of take a pause and think through what those stories can tell us, but also craft more purposeful stories by that listening, which can be rooted in kind of the best knowledge that we have and present one viewpoint. Because if the objective is to change what we're going through at the moment or address these big challenges, ultimately we're going to have some sort of a collaborative consensus. So I think instead of rushing out to change things, I think it's about listening to a diversity of voices and then thinking about having a purpose-driven story, basically.
Well, thank you. That's all we've got time for. You heard it here first. We're going to be moving to an interdisciplinary, intercultural, interspecies approach to all of our disciplines, or else that'll be the end of us. I hope we manage it. Tune into the festival this time next year to see how far we've got. But before you go, thank you to everyone who has tuned in to watch this, and thank you very much to my 4 fantastic panelists for sharing their insights today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.